Well, Christianity, as we know, includes two components: a penchant for suffering and faithfulness. So those of you who've been here for the last two and are here for the third are good Christians in one of those two categories. So, Enoch or Jesus, the quest of the historical Metatron. Annette Reed has remarked, for Gershom Scholem, the combination of apocalyptic with theosophy and cosmogony in one Enoch was, quote, by itself sufficient to prove the essential continuity of thought, end quote, that linked early Jewish apocalyptic with later Merkava mysticism. This is still Annette Reed I'm reading here. However, recent advances in scholarship, she writes, prompted by Peter Schaeffer's 1981 publication of the Hechalot Corpus, have thrown doubt upon Scholem's theory that the two traditions evidence a, quote, religious movement of a distinctive character, end quote, with an unbroken development from the anonymous conventicles of the old apocalyptics to the Merkava speculation of the Mishnaic teachers, to the Merkava mysticism of late and post-Talmudic times, end quote. If Scholem's approach could be deemed the first quest of the historical Metatron, and Schaeffer's the second quest, I have been trying to stake out a different path, a third quest. I'm not sure what an unbroken development means or is supposed to mean, but surely it ought not to mean that nothing changed between 1 and 2 and 3 Enoch, nor did Scholem intend it to mean that. On the one hand, I wish to assert the essential correctness of Scholem's intuition, while modifying it to read that the combination of cosmogony, even meteorology and theosophy in 1 and 2 Enoch, and in the Talmudic apocalypse of Babli Chagiga, as shown in last night's lecture, does bespeak a diachronic connection of one sort or another, but quite certain, between these two corpora. And moreover, the further connections between the Talmudic material and at least some of the Merkava texts testified to further continuity. At the same time, however, I categorically deny that the necessary upshot of such diachronic connectivity is either a distinct religious movement or unbroken development. All development in the history of human cultures is broken, fragmentary, reconstructive, bricolage, and this is no exception. The most crucial part of my argument is that the second chapter of Chagiga, which we have been reading throughout these lectures, contains virtually an apocalyptic anthology of the rabbis, one that both suppresses, as does the Mishnah, and at the same time reveals and adds up thematically to evidence for lively apocalyptic speculation at the time of the rabbis and even among them. In addition to the cosmogonic, and meteorological matters that we have looked at until now, there is, of course, theosophic speculation in this text as well. In Chagiga 14a, we read, all the text should be on the papers. One verse, Daniel 7:9, says, his garment was like white snow, and the hair of his head like the wool of sheep. And one verse says, his hair is curls as black as a raven. This is no difficulty. One is in court, literally sitting, i.e. in court, judging court. And the other is at war. For the master has said, there is no one more appropriate for judgment than an elder, and there is no one more appropriate for war than a youth. One verse says, his throne was flames of fire. And one verse says, until thrones were set up, and one ancient of days sat, right? So the contradiction here is between one throne or two thrones. This is no difficulty. One was for him and one for David, i.e. there were two thrones, one for the Ancient of Days, the Lord, the father we might call him, and one for David. As we have learned in a Baraita, one for him and one for David, the words of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yossi the Galilean said to him, Akiva, how long will you make the divine presence, the Shekhinah, profane? Rather, one for judgment and one for mercy. Did he, Rabbi Akiva, accept it from him, from Rabbi Yossi? Or did he not accept it from him? Come and hear. One for judgment and one for mercy, the words of Rabbi Akiva, right? So clearly Rabbi Akiva repented of his theological error of thinking that the two thrones are one for the Lord and one for David. Said to him Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Akiva, what are you doing with Haggadah? Desist from your words and go back to laws of purity and impurity, literally skin diseases and tent impurities. Anytime that Rabbi Akiva makes so bold as to make some sort of a theological comment and not a halachic comment, somebody says to him, what are you talking about? You go back to your specialty. You know about purity and impurity and not theology. Rather, one for the throne and one for the footstool. The throne to sit upon, the footstool to rest his feet. As it says, the heaven is my throne and the earth my footstool. In this text, we find thematized the apparent contradiction between God being portrayed as a wise elder and being portrayed as a youth full of vigor and passion. Two different contradictions are cited. The second one, which is the one that concerns us here, is quite explicitly the contradiction between the notion of one God and the representation, so it seems, in Daniel, of two divine figures. The second one, like a son of man, who is seated on a second throne. Daniel 7:13, the crucial but dangerous proof text, is portentously not cited explicitly, but only obliquely, through the reference to kursavan, thrones in the plural. The Tanaim cited in the Bavli both read Daniel 7 in the same way. The second throne is for a second figure, the Shekhinah, whom Rabbi Akiva identifies as David. On Rabbi Yossi's reading of Rabbi Akiva's statement, we have here then apparently both binatarianism, right? Two divine figures, Atik Yomin, the Ancient of Days, and the one like a son of man who is David, sitting on the second throne, and a theosis, right? David, the human, become divine, which latter raises Rabbi Yossi's dander. It is highly unlikely, Pache Alan Siegel, cautiously, that we are dealing here with a genuine tradition about Rabbi Akiva from early in the 2nd century, this on general methodological grounds. There may be some indication, however, that the Baraita was not at any rate produced for this context, and may even be therefore a Palestinian source. It can be seen that it does not quite fit its context in the Bavli, since the anonymous voice in the Talmud, the Stama, the redactor we might say, actually asserts the position, Rabbi Akiva's, that the Baraita appears to reject, so that there is a disconnect between the Stama's quotation of Rabbi Akiva as support for its view and then seemingly noting that he abandoned it. This at least suggests the possibility that the Baraita is an earlier and thus Palestinian, possibly Palestinian source. Let me go through my reading of the passage a bit more slowly now. Although, as I have suggested, the text and other rabbinic texts carefully, gingerly, avoids actually citing the Son of Man passage in these very Daniel verses, it is on these verses that they indeed rely. The portrayed Rabbi Akiva's point is that one of the two thrones was for the Ancient of Days and one for David, thus the one like a son of man. The crux is his identification of David, the Messiah, as the Son of Man who sits at God's right hand, thus suggesting not only a divine figure, but one who is incarnate in a human being as well. Are you the Messiah? I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. I don't think I need to give the chapter and verse for that in this crowd anyway. Hence his objectors taunt, until when will you make the divine presence profane? That is implied that the Son of Man has become incarnate in the human figure of the Davidic Messiah, or perhaps that the human David has been divinized through his presence on the second throne. Either way, Rabbi Akiva seems, at any rate to Rabbi Yossi, to be projecting a divine human Son of Man who will be the Messiah. His contemporary, Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, strenuously objects to Rabbi Akiva's dangerous interpretation and gives the verse a modalist interpretation. While I think a certain degree of caution is in order, this reading is not, shall we say, entirely provable. Notwithstanding, it seems the most plausible and compelling way to understand this text. On this reading, Rabbi Akiva's interpretation grows out of precisely the same kind of conflation of Messiah, son of David, with the redeeming divine Son of Man of Daniel 7 that we find in Mark, producing similar Christological results. Supporting this interpretation, at least in the Babylonian Talmud, we read the following passage in Sanhedrin 98a. Rabbi Alexandri said, Rabbi Yoshua the son of Levi raised a contradiction. It is written, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And it is written, poor and riding on a donkey. If they, Israel, are righteous, with the clouds of heaven. If they are not righteous, poor and riding on a donkey. Right? So if anyone doubts that the rabbis gave a messianic reading to Daniel 7, here is the proof. Right? The one like a son of man here is not Israel, but the Messiah. Right? Couldn't be clearer. It is clear that Daniel 7 had been given a messianic reading, and that there was tension felt between the Messiah of Daniel 7 and the Messiah of Zechariah 9, between the Messiah as a divine figure and the Messiah as a humiliated human being, expressed in good rabbinic fashion as a contradiction between verses, resolved in a totally topical fashion in the text. The tension and the potential it bears for an incarnational reading is nonetheless there. It is this tension, I think, that motivates the controversy between the figures of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi in the Chagiga text as well. Of course, the Talmud itself must record that Rabbi Akiva changed his mind in order for him to remain Orthodox. The Son, and Orthodox, of course, is in squiggly fingers. The Son of Man, aka two sovereignties in heaven, is thus not foreign even at the very heart of the rabbinic enterprise. Even a figure like Rabbi Akiva has to be educated as to the heretical nature of his position, suggesting once again that any absolute difference between mystical circles that embrace such theological notions and rabbinic circles that have always, as it were, rejected such quote-unquote malign influence has to be withdrawn once and for all. This is what the editors of the Talmud would want us to believe, but a different reality is easy to perceive behind their very efforts to convince. Rabbinic Judaism, qua Orthodoxy, is formed precisely out of the rejection of ideas about the Godhead that were once widely held in Jewry. And that rejection is dramatized in our text of Rabbi Akiva's re-education. Schaeffer more or less accepts and agrees with my reading of the Talmud here. We differ with respect to the textual background to the Talmudic text. For Schaeffer, it is to be explained as a late ancient Babylonian response to Christianity. The issue is then, it seems, not so much methodological, as Schaeffer wishes to present it as hermeneutical. The consequences are, however, not insignificant at all. The stakes here are nothing less than a picture of the history of relations between the religious genealogy of late ancient Jews and Christians. According to Schaeffer's approach, the Babylonian passage is completely severed from any previous rabbinic tradition. It is only thus that Schaeffer can conclude that Jewry did not continue into the rabbinic age some of its ancient apocalyptic strands, which occur also in the Gospels and thus later Christian thought, but instead that the Babylonian Jews were profoundly impacted and imitated the Christianity of their time. Once again, the issue is not methodological or theoretical, but empirical. Above in these very lectures, I have alluded to a powerful example of late ancient Christian intercourse with Babylonian rabbinic Judaism in principle, but it is a far cry from that to the gospel-reading Babylonian rabbis of Schaeffer. I turn now to the locale within the Talmudic tradition that I take to be the clearest case for such diachronic connections, namely Metatron, the rabbinic, or so I claim, successor to the Son of Man. Right? So just to give a quick summary up to this point, what I'm suggesting is, of course, a profound connection between Jewish traditions and the Gospels, but I'm suggesting that that profound tradition then splits into two branches, one that identifies Jesus of Nazareth as the Son of Man, and one that continues along the path of identifying Enoch with the Son of Man and develops that direction into medieval Judaism. After all, if we think about it, those two traditions had to be at loggerheads from the beginning, because if Enoch is the Son of Man, then Jesus can't be the Son of Man, right? So either Enoch or Jesus. So once the gospel traditions settle from Mark on Jesus as the Son of Man, then the identification of Enoch with the Son of Man that we find in the similitudes of Enoch is a different tradition, right? Is that clear what I'm suggesting? So then we have two lines of development, but from the same historical origin of the notion that there are two divine figures, the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. In what follows, I'm going to reread this famous Talmudic passage in ways that partly draw on what I've written in the past and partly overturn it to reach some new conclusions about its historical meanings. The biggest innovation here vis-a-vis my previous work on this text is that in this final edition of my thoughts on these matters, bli neder, that is, I don't actually vow that these are my final thoughts, but I hope and aspire that they will be, I will read it as integrally related to the whole Talmudic context, to what I have styled the Talmudic apocalypse yesterday. In the passage we have just looked at, we see, I maintain, a dramatic effort to suppress a certain important aspect of apocalyptic texts from Enoch to Revelation, namely the presence of a second or junior divinity, once known as the Son of Man, alongside of the Father on a second throne. Typically, moreover, this second divine person is in some shape or form a transformed human being. It is not hard nor unprecedented to see here in their most general forms the religious notions that give rise to Trinity and Incarnation. By presenting in this text, as it were, the re-education of Rabbi Akiva on these questions, David, the Messiah on a second throne, the very idea, the Talmud is indeed engaged in an act of clamping down on such thoughts. The next story can be seen as part and parcel of such efforts of suppression as well, but it needs more careful and contextual reading than I have given it before. The reading offered here, subtly different from previous ones, will further support my thesis that the material in the second chapter of Chagiga, especially in the Bavli, is a somewhat tortuous and certainly fragmentary rabbinic apocalypse. Given the close connections between the Talmudic apocalypse and Chagiga and the earlier Enoch literature exposed in the previous lecture, an old question needs to be asked anew, namely the question of the relation between a famous passage and its very near but also distinct parallel in 3 Enoch, a famous Talmudic passage. The Babylonian Talmud has a very famous and remarkable narrative of the ascent. That was me regretting using the word famous twice in 2 sentences. And remarkable narrative of the ascension of a certain Elisha ben Abuyah, nicknamed Acher, to heaven, whereupon he makes a fateful mistake, misidentifies Metatron as a god, and suffers terrible consequences. Schaeffer has made a compelling point about this narrative, in which the highest angel, potentially identified with or confused with a second divine person, namely Metatron, appears. It can only be explained, as he shows, on the basis of traditions such as those found in the book 3 Enoch, in which Enoch is transformed into Metatron explicitly. Alexander has further pointed out that Peter Alexander has further pointed out that Metatron's absorption of translated Enoch could only have taken place in circles acquainted with the Palestinian apocalyptic Enoch traditions. Schaeffer, however, declines any possibility of seeing connections between the early Enoch apocalypses, 1 and 2 Enoch, in which such an apotheosis takes place for Enoch, and the much later Hebrew text known as Sefer Hechalot, or 3 Enoch. He consequently ends up asserting, as the only possible explanation, direct Christian influence on the Talmud in late antiquity, i.e. that Metatron is produced in the Byzantine era out of whole Christian cloth as an imitation of Christ. Other scholars have taken note of the importance of 2 Slavonic Enoch in understanding the development of the later Metatron materials, a line of investigation that Schaeffer has seemed largely to ignore. The crucial point is to envision a connection between the transformation of Enoch into the Son of Man in 1 Enoch 71, Enoch's angelic transformation in 2 Enoch 22, and the transformation of Enoch into the archangel Metatron in Sefer Hechalot 3 Enoch. Right? So I'm suggesting a historical, not only I, but following Orloff and Alexander, suggesting a historical trajectory in which the human Enoch becomes the Son of Man in 1 Enoch 71, is transformed into an angel in 2 Enoch 22, and in 3 Enoch actually becomes Metatron, either an archangel or the second divine figure. We need not, I propose, imagine anything quite so radical as an all-out incursion of Christian Christology all of a sudden into Byzantine-era Babylonian Jewish texts, although I would never deny and will actively advance below the possibility or even probability of such intercourse, as at least a partial explanation for historical changes within the traditions. Why not, after all? Thus, to take one example, while already in classical rabbinic literature, God is frequently described as having a familia, there is no reason to doubt that within the Merkavah texts, the descriptions of the familia draw on images of the Byzantine court. In the text of Talmud Chagiga, we find the story of Elisha ben Abuyah's apostasy. This famous heretic, upon seeing a vision of the glorious being named Metatron sitting in heaven, wondered if perhaps there are 2 sovereignties in heaven, the arch heresy of the Talmud. Notoriously, we find an almost identical but significantly different parallel to this text in Sefer Hechalot. Please follow along now, because I'm not going to read the right column, I'll only read the Talmudic column, and you'll see the differences as we go along. Our rabbis have taught, 4 went into the Pardes, and who are they? Ben Azai and Ben Zomah, Acher and Rabbi Akiva. Acher chopped down the shoots, Rabbi Akiva came out safely. right? So bad things happened to 3 of them, but Rabbi Akiva came out safely. Acher had chopped down the shoots, whatever that means, we'll see right away. Acher chopped down the shoots. Of him the verse says, do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin. What does this mean? He saw that Metatron had been given permission to sit and write the good deeds of Israel. He said, but it is taught that on high there will be no sitting, no conflict, no back, and no tiredness. Perhaps, God forbid, there are 2 powers, 2 sovereignties, shtei reshuyot. They took Metatron out and whipped him with 60 whips of fire. They said to him, what is the reason that when you saw him, you did not get up before him? Metatron was given permission to erase the good deeds of Acher. A voice came out from heaven and said, return, O backsliding ones, except for Acher. In other words, Acher has committed the sin against the Holy Spirit, from which there can be no repentance, no forgiveness. He said, since that man has, he, that is Acher, since that man, referring to himself, has been driven out of that world, let him go out and enjoy himself in this world. He went out to evil culture. He went and found a prostitute and solicited her. She said, but aren't you Elisha ben Abuyah? He went and uprooted a radish on the Sabbath and gave it to her. She said, he is an other Acher, right? Explaining why he is called Acher, right? Famous rabbi comes and solicits the prostitute. She said, but aren't you the famous rabbi? So he goes and proves he's not by violating the Sabbath. So she says, oh, I must have confused him with somebody else. Right? Although the Talmudic text and its relationship to 3 Enoch have been interpreted quite a few times in recent scholarship and even very recently, there is still, it seems, more to be said. Rejecting earlier attempts to argue direct dependence of one of the versions on the other, as well as claims for very different meanings for the 2 versions, I shall claim that it is unlikely that one was copied from the other. And perhaps more surprisingly, that they both add up ideologically to the same thing, despite vast literary and other differences between them. It is crucial to observe that it is the sitting of Metatron that precipitates the crisis for Elisha in both texts. He saw that Metatron had been given permission to sit and write the good deeds of Israel. Most commentators do not, I think, take sufficient measure of the significance of this detail, and indeed it has been partially obscured within the textual transmission of the Talmud itself. In the Hechalot, the 3 Enoch version of the story as well, Metatron himself emphasizes that he was seated on a throne and judging on the authority of the Holy One. I think it highly likely that this statement of authority, to sit, is a marked allusion to the very enthronement scene in Daniel 7, which has been the pumping heart of the tradition. The one like a son of man who is seated on a throne and awarded sholtan in Aramaic, Greek exousia, Hebrew reshut. Acher's confusion is occasioned precisely by this allusion, which he gets too. Is it possible that the interpretation of those verses from Daniel, so current in Israel and lately declared heretical, is true? Perhaps there are indeed 2 sovereignties, shtei reshuyot, a father and a son in heaven. The cause of Acher's theological confusion, as we have it in the Textus Receptus of the Bavli, is, however, very puzzling. On the one hand, it is clear that it is the fact of Metatron sitting that causes Acher to fall into error. But on the other hand, his own speech about this seems incoherent, or nearly so, as he remarks that, but it is taught that on high there will be no standing, no sitting, no jealousy, no conflict, no back, and no tiredness. How is the rest of this list, other than the sitting itself, to be connected with Metatron's seated posture? And what in this long list caused Acher to consider the possibility of two sovereignties in heaven? On the one hand, there are indications, at least in most witnesses, that the sitting evoked thoughts of competition between God and Metatron. But directly contradicting that is the suggestion that Metatron sat because he was tired, which would certainly suggest his mortality, not his divinity. The list is in short incoherent and self-contradictory if we understand it to be the cause of Acher's error. Philip Alexander suggests that the list has been imported from another text, which is not extant, in which it is asserted that God and the angels are without body parts or passions. In rather Platonic fashion, it defined the heavenly world as the negation of all that we know and experience here on earth. We can build a bit further on this crucial insight. Michal Bar Asher Segal, who was, I think, once present in this university for several years, in fact, she did her PhD here, if I'm not mistaken, remarked of this list that it is hermeneutic in character. Each of the elements in the list refers to a verse. Thus, for standing, we find Numbers 12:5, where the verse reads, "And the Lord came down on a column of cloud and stood in front of the tent." Or for another striking example, when the verse Job 25:2, "He makes peace in his heaven," is taken to mean that there is conflict and competition, tacharut, in heaven by the early Midrash, using in this case exactly the same word as that which our text denies. Similarly, we can find verses that suggest, imply, or actually impute jealousy, tiredness, and sitting, of course. The crux back is now neatly solved as well. Referring to the back of God that Moses allegedly saw, the text denies the literal existence of that as well. Our statement comes, therefore, Maimonidean avant la figure, to indicate that these are all metaphorical and not literal statements and no more. The original point of the statement was simply that God has no body and thus none of these characteristics that seem implied by the biblical text. However, this statement, which was implanted in the Talmudic text, is completely at odds with the rest of the Talmudic narrative, which is precisely and exclusively about sitting, engendering confusion with God, not about a Godhead who ought to be disembodied. Right? In other words, that might have been a little bit dense for hearing, so let me quickly gloss it. The 3 Enoch text says only that God sat him on the throne and gave him permission to judge, and that when Elisha came up there, he saw him sitting and judging and said, "Oh my God, there's a second divinity." The Talmudic text, I'm reconstructing, essentially says exactly the same thing, but in order to, as it were, camouflage that, another midrashic statement denying any physical attributes to God was imported and put into the text, causing the text to be incoherent, but actually disguising the fact that it was the sitting, the second divinity that was, or the imagination of the second divinity that was disturbing and confusing to Elisha and made him think that there are two divine figures. The issue on this reconstruction is precisely the sitting, and the specter that called up was precisely two sovereigns in heaven. That theologumenon that was so closely connected with the doubled throne of Daniel 7, as well as the theological developments of that within the world that surrounded the rabbis into a doctrine of two divine persons, wherever such developments had taken place or were still taking place. There is another support for this conclusion as well. The word translated permission would be much better translated as authority, power, or sovereignty, as it is the same word, reshut, that appears in that very heretical thought of Acher's. Perhaps, God forbid, there are two sovereigns, shtei reshuyot. and indeed bears close comparison with Greek exousia too. Far better, I think, to translate two sovereignties in heaven. The same word that is used to indicate the authority or sovereignty given Metatron to sit and write the virtues of Israel, reshut, is used to indicate the name of the alleged heresy, two reshuyot. I suggest, therefore, that it was the combination of sitting, suggesting enthronement, and authority or sovereignty to sit and judge that is represented as both Acher's mistake, bringing the Talmudic text very, very, and crucially close to the 3 Enoch version, in which it is the fact of Metatron's enthronement which leads to the idea of two sovereignties. Both versions, 3 Enochs and the Talmuds, as I interpret it, go back to Daniel 7:13, and the Talmudic reshut is the equivalent in Hebrew of the Sholtan, awarded the one like a son of man there, where the Septuagint gives, of course, exousia. When Acher saw that sovereignty had been awarded to Metatron to sit, it is no wonder that he concluded, even tentatively, that there are two sovereignties in heaven, namely precisely God and that one like a son of man, to whom sovereignty, Sholtan, had been awarded in Daniel. Whether called Metatron or David, Enoch or Jesus, the second divine figure is the Son of Man. Locating this quote-unquote heretical interpretation right at the heart of the Rabbinic Academy, and indeed among some of its leading figures, strongly supports the hypothesis offered above that these views had been current in the very Jewish circles from which the rabbis emerged, and the views were eventually anathematized by them and driven out. Following then Alexander's insight that the phrase, "But it is taught that on high there will be no standing, no sitting, no jealousy, no competition, no back, and no tiredness," is an import into the text from another context entirely, albeit a very early import, the weak explanation for Elisha's error given by the Talmud can be understood as part of the very process of camouflage of the real reason for Elisha's confusion, which is identical to that of 3 Enoch. In the version in 3 Enoch, it is the sitting on a throne, and with it the imputation of sovereignty that so discomfits Elisha that he becomes Acher, the other one, the one who is other to himself. This is the case in the Talmud's version as well, if we remove the imported words from the text and reconstruct a proto-Talmudic version, which would then read, "He saw that Metatron had been given sovereignty, reshut, to sit and write the good deeds of Israel. Perhaps, God forbid, there are two sovereignties." In other words, I reconstruct in the ground of the Talmudic text something that is almost identical to the 3 Enoch text. This reconstruction would make absolutely clear the good reason for Elisha's error. If my reconstruction and interpretation bear weight, then there is very little, almost no ideological difference between the text in the Talmud and in 3 Enoch. The sitting is indeed the crux, as it invokes the Daniel 7 passage, together with Psalms 110:1, e.g., as in Mark 14:62, with the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God. Orloff, moreover, has compellingly shown that the motif of Enoch sitting in heaven comes out very clearly in 2 Enoch. The ascription to Metatron in the Talmudic text of both judicial and scribal roles, precisely those given to the Son of Man as early as the similitudes of Enoch, strongly supports this connection as well. The sitting is indeed the crux, as it invokes the Daniel 7 passage, just as I have just said. The ascription to the Talmudic text cannot, in my view, be isolated or insulated from the Enoch tradition as represented in 3 Enoch. It is engaged in a massive struggle as it itself seems to understand with such highly ancient and well-rooted elements of Jewish religiosity as the second throne and a second divine person who absorbs the translated Enoch. It is simply then not the case that the so-called pseudepigraphic literature had no legs in later Judaism and was only preserved within Christian circles. This is the major point of my argument here throughout. Without denying the probable interchange between Jews and Christians in such matters, and indeed supporting it strongly below, I would propose that these apocalyptic traditions remain vital among Jews without making any absolutely clear distinction between the rabbis and other Jews on this point. Imagining that alongside of other developments within late ancient Jewish culture, various forms of apocalyptic writing also continued and developed new forms interacting in differing ways with other streams of rabbinic and para-rabbinic tradition, including those that sought to suppress those apocalyptic traditions. Right? So within the same text, the Talmud, you're getting almost a battle between revealing and concealing of the apocalyptic material. The 3 Enoch text is at least as at much pains to clarify that Metatron devotion does not constitute a theological assertion of 2 powers as the Bavli is. Accordingly, pace much of the scholarly tradition, there is no great ideological gap between these 2 parallel versions. Neither denies the significance of Metatron, and both assert that to see in him a divinity is a grave error. Right? There is, in my view, in both texts, a nexus of concern about the import and possible misreading of Daniel 7:9-13, which connects that text, the Talmud, in multiple ways with other texts, including ancient Palestinian apocalyptic sources, such as the parables of Enoch and 2 Enoch. Usually we assume that only Christians read the one like a son of man as a divine figure, and that Jews universally accept the interpretation that it's a symbol for Israel. What I'm suggesting is that the picture is considerably more complex, that there were Jews, as we saw explicitly in that Talmudic passage, that read the one like a son of man as a divine Messiah figure, and other Jews who accepted that this is a Enoch or Metatron, but then denied that Enoch Metatron is actually divine. Right? So it almost parallels what we might call late ancient Christological controversies, in a sense. To sum up, according to my reconstruction, a text very like the one in 3 Enoch underlies the Talmud's version as well. Metatron had been given reshut to sit and write, and Elisha concluded quite plausibly that there are shtei reshuyot, 2 sovereignties, because supposedly only the divine king may sit on a throne in heaven, just as, by the way, only a king of the house of David may sit in the earthly temple. Right? So if anybody's sitting down there, we would assume that they were the king. In order to further suppress any such possibility, the Bavli imported the Platonic Midrashic text about sitting and standing and necks and tiredness, and thus obliterated the throne, thus distorting the text and rendering Acher's response a barely intelligible reaction to a contradiction between a tradition that angels don't sit and Metatron sitting. It is not clear in any case how this contradiction about the postures of angels would lead Acher to conclude or even speculate that there are 2 powers in heaven, whereas finding Metatron on a godly throne with sovereignty surely would do that. I wish now to reassess my former position that the Talmudic text is in some way dependent on the version in 3 Enoch. This reassessment will, moreover, conduct us to the conclusions that I draw and the hypothesis that I offer in this lecture series. Right? So we're on the downstretch, as it were, the home stretch. Until now, the question of the relation of the version of the narrative in the Talmud to the narrative in 3 Enoch has been discussed in terms of who came first and who copied from whom. Having myself taken a position on the question put in those terms, I propose now to reform and reformulate the question anew, as I no longer believe in direct dependence in either direction. The most important point is that there is no conflict between the two versions of the text when they are interpreted in the fashion proposed here. Nor is the story in its 3 Enoch version in tension with or a corrective of the context in the Talmud. The comparison with the 4th century church fathers afforded by Kister, I skipped all the Kister stuff. So, the bottom line is that both of these versions of the story of Elisha seem clearly to go back to an earlier version, which contained the common elements of the narrative found in both the extant versions, and from which each of the current versions was developed independently. The general suggestion that even the relatively late 3 Enoch preserves important connections with earlier apocalyptic is now supported by an important argument in a recent article by Menachem Kister on these subjects. While Kister disagrees with me in many details of interpretation, on this point our positions seem synergistic. Kister demonstrates impressive connections between specific languages in the 3 Enoch tradition and in both the apocalypse of Abraham and the ascension of Isaiah. Very, very specific formulations and linguistic forms, therefore supporting strongly the connection between 3 Enoch in the 5th, 6th, or maybe even 7th century, and texts like the Apocalypse of Abraham, the Ascension of Isaiah from late antiquity. Okay, last section. Die Wanderjahre des jungen Metatrons. There is no doubt that Metatron himself is the historical product of various developments within Jewish tradition. As shown by Alexander in a pioneering paper, Metatron seems clearly to be the conflation of at least 3 figures from earlier Jewish traditions. Enoch, the lesser Yahu, right, Yahu HaKatan, and Michael, Metatron. There is further proof for Alexander's contention that Michael is identified with Metatron. In the 5th, 6th century, the visions of Ezekiel, we find the following paragraph. What is there in Zavul? And you remember that Zavul is one of the 7 heavens. I think it's the 4th. Rabbi Levi said in the name of Rabbi Chama bar Ukba, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the prince dwells nowhere but in Zavul. And what is his name? Kimos is his name. Rabbi Isaac said, Me'ata is his name. Rabbi Inyanei bar Sison said, Bizbul is his name. Rabbi Tanchum the elder said, Atakya is his name. Elazar Nadwadya said, Metatron, like the name of the power. Alexander correctly observes that the prince here identified with Metatron is the archangel Michael, much identified with the Son of Man in earlier texts as well. Metatron, wherever his name comes from, is a link in a chain of tradition about Michael that goes back at least to the book of Daniel. We can add another proof to this contention. In the Talmudic passage of the 7 heavens discussed in the previous lecture here, it is precisely and explicitly the great prince Michael, who is identified as presiding over the 3rd heaven, Zavul, right? Just as here we found Michael. It is clear that in the Talmudic text, Michael is the heavenly high priest, just as Metatron is in 3 Enoch. Metatron is clearly an avatar of Michael. There is accordingly little or no reason to adopt or even entertain Schaeffer's position that Metatron is an entirely Babylonian product or envious mimesis of Christology. Sometimes reading the scholarly literature on Metatron, I feel like I am observing the blind pundits with their proverbial elephant, The one grasping the trunk thought that an elephant was a snake. The one grasping the leg thought that it was a tree. And the one grasping the tail thought an elephant is a rope. Scholars of Byzantine Christianity see only Byzantine Christian elements here. And latterly, scholars of Middle Persian have located Metatron's origins in Zoroastrian figures, namely Yima. Like those pundits, so I claim, they may all be right. Many other scholars, even those relatively close to Schaeffer's general opinions in these matters, nonetheless maintain that there were diachronic connections between 1 and 2 Enoch and 3 Enoch. Now, if it be granted that there are intimate diachronic connections between 1 and 2 Enoch and 3 Enoch, it seems far more plausible to ascribe the transformation of Enoch into Metatron in the last text to a continuation of themes from the earlier ones. Surely far superior a hypothesis, the one that has Metatron invented de novo. Since we have little reason to believe, and surely no evidence, that 1 and 2 Enoch passed to the Jews from Christian circles that had preserved them, we might as well assume that at least these traditions, if not these texts, had circulated among Jews, as well as among Ethiopian, Slavonic, and perhaps Coptic Christians. This conclusion is well supported by the evidence adduced here for close affiliations between the Talmudic apocalypse of Chagiga and the cosmo-meteorological material from 1 Enoch and 2 Enoch. The Tanaim were not the only Jews between the Second Temple and the Byzantine period. That's what we have to remember. There aren't only rabbis. Very close to the view being promulgated here, indeed anticipating it, is the following statement once again by Annette Reed. The older scholarly model of an unbroken continuity between 1 and 3 Enoch must be replaced with the image of an ongoing process of redaction and accretion of material by which the Hechalot traditions and the 3 Enoch tradition were continually reshaped through the integration of both early Enochic and Rabbinic traditions by a variety of different hands. On the other hand, the possible role of the Byzantine chronographers in the transmission of early Enochic materials to some of these circles may help to explain how 1 Enoch may have influenced parts of 3 Enoch in a manner that was historically distinct from the development of other Enochic themes within later mystical traditions. With further analysis of individual units within the 3 Enoch macroforms, we may hopefully begin to formulate a more nuanced image of the complex relationship between the early Jewish apocalypses and the Hechalot literature, end quote. It is indeed a distinct possibility that Byzantine Jews knew about 1 Enoch from the chronographers. Equally as plausible that the text circulated among Greek-speaking Jews in the same environments as those very chronographers. In either case, a far cry indeed from either Sholom's secret conventicles or Schaeffer's imitation of Christ. Much of our understanding of the historical relations between Jewish and Christian communities from late antiquity and into the Byzantine era depends on the ever-growing complexity with which we approach the task of that which I have styled the quest of the historical Metatron. Equally nuanced as the view of Reed is Ra'anan Bustan's. In each case, the vertical silo created by internalist interpretations of the Jewish mystical tradition, no matter how dialectical, has begun to give way to a horizontal orientation in the study of Jewish history. Rather than seek the roots of Jewish mystical and magical discourses within a hermetically sealed Jewish culture and documenting their linear, even teleological development through successive stages of Judaism, many scholars are increasingly taking up the challenge of tracing the crisscrossing roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, of conceptual and material exchange at and across the boundaries of religious community and tradition, end quote. Schaeffer's model of a unitary and essential Judaism and Christianity, which then may influence each other, is just as silo-like as anything Sholem ever produced, just with 2 silos next to each other, one occasionally spilling over into the other. Or I'm thinking of cartoons that I must have seen as a child of, two embattled cities next to each other, completely enclosed in walls, and every once in a while somebody throws a stone from one over the wall into the other. Another way of stating this would be that according to both Sholem and Schaeffer, mutatis mutandis, Judaism and Christianity are much more distinct and bounded entities than in the more nuanced and complex models offered by such scholars as Bustan and Reed. In this communique, my purpose will have been served if I have successfully added to the complex ingredients of the bricolage ongoing traditions and memories of traditions that tie the Hechalot text back historically to forms of life, thinking, experience, and writing that extend to the Second Temple apocalyptic as well, and thus to the sources of both later Judaism and Christianity. Metatron is neither the father of Jesus nor his son, but if you can stand this metaphor, the scion of a parallel branch of the family lineage. Thank you.